Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen, and with us for our program today, Assemblyman Bob Oaks. Bob Oaks represents the 128th Assembly District. The 128th District includes Wayne, Cayuga, and Oswego counties. Thank you folks in that area for joining us today. And thank you, Bob Oaks, for being here. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Mike.
We've got lots to talk about, issues that are being discussed here at the state capitol that are important to you folks watching, things like the minimum wage legislation. And, of course, we want to get an update on the property tax cap that was put in place a couple years ago and how that impacted the recent round of school votes that took place in the 128th District and all across the state, too. But Bob Oaks, we got some local issues to talk about. You've got a contingent of local officials coming to Albany to meet with you today. There's a lot of problems that are being faced by parts of your community, the area that you represent, specifically along the shore of Lake Ontario. Let's start with the apple crops. The apples seem to be in a pretty bad place this year, the entire industry in your area.
It is, Mike, and it's still being assessed. But I've joined with a number of other legislators across upstate New York, asking the governor to declare a federal disaster area. What that allows is the ability for the federal government to do some assessments and possibly provide some support for people most impacted by that. There is crop insurance that some of those farmers have that could be helpful as well. But what we're looking at, Mike, we had a real warm March. In fact, March was warmer than April. First ever in my lifetime that I can imagine. I grew up on a small apple farm about 3 miles away from Lake Ontario. The reason the lake is so important is it keeps it cooler in the spring, so that when it warms up, it doesn't warm up so fast, and then the blossoms are held back, and then they don't get frozen out. Well, this year was an exception, and we ended up with very warm weather, freezing weather, warm weather, freezing weather. Okay. And as I talked to the apple farmers through that time, they kept saying, I think we've dodged the bullet, I think we've dodged the bullet. But then right near the end of April, we had 3 days of very cold weather. In some areas, it even got down into the teens. The blossoms were far along, and it had some dramatic impact. Now, some farms have been impacted a lot differently than others. Some have, very honestly, 100% loss. They're not going to have any fruit this year. Other farms have been impacted where they're still uncertain, but some of the later varieties, the blossoms hadn't come along that far, and so they may be impacted to a lesser degree. But clearly, when you look at nearly $100 million of an industry on an annual basis being here in Wayne County, and very honestly, the shoreline as it goes into Cayuga and Oswego County, and certainly back to the west, New Orleans and Monroe, this is the largest apple growing region in the state that is second in the nation. New York is second in the nation for apple growing. And it's not just apples, it's also those fruits like peaches and apricots and cherries, especially the ones with the pit. Those have pretty much been wiped out as well. And so a difficult time. We're going to talk some with the supervisors along the shoreline about those issues today in Albany, and as well as other issues.
Yeah, I mean, how devastating can that be? You've got a farm that your entire reason for existence is to grow and sell apples, and if you've got 100% loss of your crops, can they survive that sort of thing?
Well, that's a good question. I'm sure there will be some, some are probably better off than others to withstand that type of loss. Some think of somebody who's just starting out.
Right.
And doesn't have the reserves of other years. It could be very difficult. The other thing is, Mike, as I was talking to them, keeping your trees healthy doesn't go away. So if you have no apples, they still may have to spray the tree multiple times and keep expending money on the trees. You have to keep grass mowed and whatever in the area. Certainly what it will impact also, though, is the people who work in that area. We normally have obviously some local people, but a lot of people from outside the area who would normally come and work to harvest the apples and do apple packing and whatever. A lot of those jobs are just not going to be available this year. And one of the concerns is that's already an issue. Labor for harvesting fruit is already an issue. If you have people you can't hire this year and they've been coming for multiple years and they go somewhere else to find a job, they may find a place they're comfortable with that they stay next year. And so when you go to get that person to come back, they may not be available. So there's significant implication. The other thing is, Mike, very honestly, just within the last couple of years, there's been substantial amount of investment in new packing houses, new storage facilities for the growing fruit crop in the area. We've gone from 15,000 to 20,000 acres of apples in just the last few years, built some significant facilities. Those are now, you still have to pay the bill and the payments on those. And so it is a bit of a tenuous time, a lot of concern, and we're hopeful that we can get through this and move on to the next year.
And this letter to the governor calling for the declaration of a disaster area, that could be a help, a big support to those farms that are facing this?
Absolutely, and we're hopeful that the governor will be responsive to that. But very honestly, even though this was now 3 weeks ago, there's still an assessment of how deep the damage is, because you're not sure, is it a total loss or not? Will there be a few apples here? Will this farmer do okay? All of that is still yet to be determined.
So these supervisors that are coming, they're here to talk about the apples. There's also that ongoing question about the lake levels on Lake Ontario and how that affects the homeowners, the property owners that have lake property. Let's talk about that a little bit and where that discussion is.
Very honestly, the supervisors who are coming today, their first reason for coming is they have a meeting with the Department of Environmental Conservation this afternoon in Albany with officials from there to talk about Lake Ontario lake levels. Lake Ontario is the only one of the Great Lakes that there is really an ability to manage some of the lows that the water might be and the highs that the water might be. Because of developing the St. Lawrence Seaway back some 50 years ago, in creating that, there are locks that are put in an outflow at the end of that system that allows you to actually let more water out or whatever. And so basically when that agreement was done 50 years ago, they end up taking the historic highs and historic lows and kind of saying, we're going to try to manage the water within this. Now, if you get a whole lot of water, you can't let enough out. And so it's not like a perfect system, but they end up managing the water basically within a certain area. The proposal now is to let it go to more of the historic highs and historic lows. Well, that means when it's really low water, recreational boating may not be able to utilize, you may not be able to get your boat out.
In and out of your dock, right?
Absolutely. Sure. And it could also have an impact then on fishing and some of the recreational sports. If you let it go to historic highs, you also have property owners who, battered by the lake water in a storm and whatever, could be impacted dramatically.
Low-lying areas are covered with water.
Very honestly, and if you take Sodas Point's kind of a low-lying community. Mm-hmm. If we go to some of these historic highs, we could have some significant damage here. So the supervisors are going to be meeting with DEC officials to establish some of their concerns. They're also going to be meeting with myself and several assembly members and senators to talk about those issues as well.
All right. How about the school votes? How did your schools do? Did the budgets pass for the most part this year?
Actually, the people that I represent, I think, are in 17 different school districts. And all of those districts did experience a passage of their votes. I think from that, this year, if you did just a first glance, all of those districts stayed within the cap. All of those districts had their votes passed. You might look and say it worked with success. I think, though, like the apples, an assessment of looking a little longer out and taking a look back will be helpful. Certainly the state putting more money into education this year after taking away a substantial amount last year has impacted that situation.
It was certainly a, excuse me, a bit of a culture shock a couple of years ago when that cap went into place, but it was coupled at the same time with some reductions in aid to school districts from Albany. It was kind of a double whammy there.
It absolutely was a double whammy.
And so now it seems as if it's settling out a little bit. The school districts are kind of used to it now. The local governments as well have been dealing with it. So as you said, it'll be interesting to get a few more years and then have some real ability to look at the data and see just how successful an experiment this is. If it's successful, maybe the state should have its own tax cap of sorts.
Well, actually, we spending cap, a number of us have suggested that we have. So
yeah, and that brings us kind of to our last issue of the day, and that is the minimum wage legislation that was discussed here at the state capitol, voted on in the state assembly. This was not an agreed upon bill, which means there wasn't a companion bill in the Senate. You kind of knew this wasn't going anywhere, but it was still an interesting debate because it let members in the assembly kind of talk about the different ways that you can help support those lower income people that you represent. Not everybody thought raising the minimum wage was the best way to do that.
Well, you know, we have a overall economy that is still pretty fragile, I think, and we're seeing some recovery, but not booming recovery. And I think it's an argument over how do you best help people at the lower end of this, and is the best way to help them by raising the minimum wage so that they'll have more money in their pocket. And that was, those people who voted yes said that's the best way to help. I ended up voting in opposition to it for a number of different reasons. But when you look at, my concern is the number of people working. We still aren't seeing the growth. And if you look at a summer jobs program and you have a certain number of people working and you raise the minimum wage 17.5%, that means for every 6, you got to take one away and you only have 5 people working. If you're a business that says we normally hire 12 people to test them out and give them a chance, and we're probably going to keep 4, and we hire them at minimum wage, they would normally hire 12. Under this, you'd only be able to hire 10. Now, my sense is, does that give more people an opportunity to enter the workforce or fewer? You know, and if you're that 11th and 12th person who don't get that opportunity, that's not that great. So those are a couple of reasons that I would just say right offhand, I don't think it works. And there's also, you know, a number of businesses that are, you look at youth. We want as many youth working as we can. Raising it up, are they worth what a possible increase in the minimum wage might be? And so I think all those issues come together to say, should we be doing this now or not? And my feeling is this isn't the time to be doing that. As well, another provision of it was to, in the future, index this so there would be automatic increases in the minimum wage.
It was interesting to hear those people who stood up and said, you know, let's go back to what certain members of the legislature have been saying for a long time, that if we could just roll back taxes, and what a good advantage and break that would give to the low-income earners, and also in all the other ways that less taxes would really help the people that create the jobs in the state, and so on and so on.
And maybe we would get more jobs that way and get people working if we focused on some of that relief.
It was an interesting debate, and there's going to be another one probably coming up before the end of this legislative session as the governor and the legislative leaders work on this bill. Bob Oaks, thanks for joining us today. We are out of time, so thank you folks too for spending your time with us, and we'll hope to see you soon for our next Assembly Calendar.